Imagine for a moment entire communities living in balance with their traditions, cultures, and the land of their ancestors. Then, suddenly, foreign powers arrive, bringing with them new systems of governance that override centuries of customs. This is where the story of colonial governance and indigenous rights begins. When colonial empires expanded their reach, they did more than claim territories, they imposed laws and political structures that systematically pushed indigenous people to the margins. Their voices were silenced, their traditions disrupted, and their rights ignored. What followed was not just the loss of land but the erosion of identity itself. History shows us that colonial rule deeply altered the social, economic, and political fabric of indigenous communities. And these changes were not temporary, they are still felt today. Broken treaties, undermined legal protections, and unfulfilled promises led many indigenous groups to rise in resistance. Their fight was not only for sovereignty but also for dignity, recognition, and the preservation of their way of life. Even now, the echoes of those struggles shape our world. Indigenous peoples continue to demand justice, and societies everywhere are beginning to acknowledge these past injustices. Reconciliation, dialogue, and the protection of indigenous rights are no longer just historical debates, they are urgent calls for action in the present. As we explore this chapter of history, the question before us is clear: how do we learn from the past, and how do we ensure that indigenous voices are not just remembered but respected and empowered in the future? Picture history as a vast tapestry, each thread representing power, culture, or resistance. Now imagine these threads being woven together, not by choice, but by the force of colonial rule. The historical context of colonial governance is exactly that, a complex fabric created by empires determined to control indigenous populations. But this story is more than just laws and systems. It is a story of how foreign powers imposed their ideologies, reshaped societies, and built administrative structures that served one purpose: dominance. To understand the struggles of indigenous communities today, we must step back into this history. Colonial governance did not simply occupy land, it rewrote traditions, altered governance, and left legacies that still shape modern nations. From the origins of colonial expansion to the administrative machinery that enforced control, this chapter reveals how deeply colonialism penetrated the lives of indigenous peoples. This is not just about the past, it is about the echoes that still define the present. Close your eyes and travel back to the late 15th century, an era known as the Age of Exploration. The seas were alive with ships sailing into the unknown, their sails filled with ambition, greed, and dreams of glory. European powers, Spain and Portugal leading the way, set out on daring voyages. Their goals? Gold, silver, and new trade routes. Their discoveries would reshape the world forever. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas boldly divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, as if entire continents and their people were prizes on a map. But the race didn't end there. Soon, France, Britain, and the Netherlands joined the scramble. With them came a dangerous ideology, the belief in European superiority. Colonizers spoke of a civilizing mission, claiming it was their duty to bring progress, Christianity, and order to those they labeled primitive or savage. This idea, wrapped in the phrase "the white man's burden," became the moral cover for exploitation and domination. Yet, colonialism was never just about armies and conquest. It was about systems, laws, administration, and control. Entire governance structures were imposed on indigenous societies. Traditional leaders were stripped of power, or worse, absorbed into colonial administrations, turning them into intermediaries between their people and foreign rulers. This fractured communities and eroded centuries-old systems of self-rule. The origins of colonial rule, therefore, are not just stories of exploration and discovery. They are stories of disruption, of cultures torn apart, and of a legacy that continues to shape our world today. Imagine a thriving community, people living off the land, sharing harvests, and passing down traditions through song and story. Now picture this harmony being shattered by the arrival of colonial rule. The impact on indigenous communities was not only profound, it was devastating. New economic systems were imposed, designed not for the benefit of the locals but for the colonizers. Subsistence farming that once provided food and security gave way to cash crops, grown for export. Families who once fed themselves now faced hunger, poverty, and dependency on foreign markets. Even the environment suffered, as forests were stripped, rivers polluted, and sacred lands exploited for resources. But the wound ran deeper than economics. Colonizers sought to reshape entire identities. Indigenous cultures, languages, and religions were labeled as barriers to progress. Missionaries spread Christianity with zeal, while schools taught indigenous children to abandon their mother tongues, their traditions, and even their sense of self. What was once a proud heritage was now dismissed as something to be erased. And when communities resisted, they faced unimaginable violence. Massacres, forced relocations, and concentration camps became grim tools of control. Entire populations were decimated, not only by bullets and chains but also by foreign diseases they had no immunity against. The result? A legacy of trauma, passed from one generation to the next. Even today, indigenous communities around the world continue to struggle with the scars of colonization, still fighting for recognition, sovereignty, and the restoration of what was taken from them. This is not just history, it is a wound that still bleeds. Imagine standing in a land once ruled by its own traditions and leaders, where justice was rooted in culture and governance was tied to community. Now picture foreign powers arriving not only with armies but with entire systems of administration designed to control every aspect of life. The structures of colonial administration were not all the same. Some empires, like the French and the Belgians, believed in direct rule. They built centralized bureaucracies, imposed their own laws, and sought to assimilate indigenous people into their culture, erasing identities in the name of civilization. Others, like the British, favored indirect rule. In this system, local leaders were kept in place but turned into intermediaries between the colonizers and their own people. At first glance, this seemed pragmatic, even respectful of tradition. But in reality, it created divisions, reinforced hierarchies, and often turned leaders against their own communities. At the heart of every colonial administration was a single priority: resource extraction. Land tenure systems stripped indigenous peoples of their ancestral lands. Taxation and forced labor reduced proud communities into exploited workforces. The very connection between people and their land was severed, leaving wounds that would last for generations. And then came the laws. Legal frameworks criminalized indigenous customs, labeled traditions as backward, and signed treaties that were rarely honored. These treaties almost always favored colonial interests, and their betrayal became a source of conflict that still lingers in post-colonial societies today. The story of colonial administration, then, is one of power and ideology colliding with resistance. Rooted in greed and racial superiority, these systems disrupted entire civilizations. To understand today's struggles for indigenous rights, we must first confront this history and the structures that sought to silence indigenous voices. Imagine a time when entire nations lived freely on their ancestral lands, guided by traditions, laws, and systems of justice that had stood for centuries. Then, foreign powers arrived, not as guests, but as rulers. With them came new governments, strange economic systems, and foreign cultural norms that began to unravel the very fabric of indigenous life. The colonial period was more than just an era of conquest, it was a time of profound upheaval. Indigenous rights were stripped away piece by piece. Land was seized, resources were drained, and communities that once thrived in autonomy found themselves subjected to laws that were never theirs. Colonial powers wrote legal frameworks that criminalized age-old customs, reducing indigenous practices to superstitions in the eyes of the law. Rights that had been sacred for generations were dismissed with the stroke of a pen. Yet, amid this oppression, there was always resistance. Brave men and women stood against the tide, fighting for their lands, their cultures, and their identities, even when the cost was unimaginable. History is filled with case studies of rights violations, forced relocations, unequal treaties, and the silencing of entire cultures. Each story reveals not only the cruelty of colonial systems but also the resilience of indigenous communities who refused to surrender their dignity. To understand the present-day struggles for recognition and justice, we must return to this painful chapter of history. For the story of indigenous rights under colonial rule is not just about the past, it is the foundation of battles still being fought today. Imagine a courtroom where the law itself is tilted against you. The judge, the jury, and even the rules of justice have already been written by someone who wants your land, your resources, and your freedom. That was the reality for Indigenous peoples during the colonial period. Colonial powers created legal frameworks not to protect, but to legitimize their control. Laws, treaties, and statutes were drafted as tools of dispossession. On paper, they promised fairness. In practice, they erased centuries of Indigenous rights and traditions. Take, for example, the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. It was meant to guarantee the Lakota Nation ownership of the Black Hills, a land sacred to them. But when gold was discovered there, the treaty was ignored, torn apart by greed. What was written as protection became a weapon of betrayal. The British Crown's Royal Proclamation of 1763 tells a similar story. It recognized Indigenous land rights and declared that land could only be surrendered through formal agreements with the Crown. A noble promise, but one that settlers and colonial administrators routinely broke, pushing westward, taking what was never theirs. These so-called legal frameworks were one-sided. They were cloaked in the language of justice, yet served only colonial interests. They manipulated treaties, stripping away lands, eroding traditions, and planting the seeds of conflict that still echo today. This is not just dusty history, it is the foundation of ongoing struggles. Every broken treaty, every ignored proclamation, still weighs heavily on Indigenous communities, reminding us that laws can either be instruments of justice or tools of injustice, depending on who writes them and why. Picture this: a community standing on the edge of its homeland, watching as foreign flags rise where their traditions once stood. The land that held their ancestors' stories, their rivers, their sacred grounds, all being claimed in the name of colonial power. What could they do? For many Indigenous peoples, the answer was clear: resist. Resistance movements became the heartbeat of survival. Some fought with words, others with weapons. From peaceful protests to full-scale uprisings, every act of defiance carried the same message: we will not disappear. Leaders rose from within the communities, mobilizing their people to defend their lands, their rights, and their identity. One powerful example is the American Indian Movement, AIM, founded in the 1960s. AIM spoke out against poverty, discrimination, and broken treaties. In 1969, they seized the abandoned Alcatraz Island, transforming it into a powerful symbol of protest. That occupation shook the conscience of a nation, forcing the world to confront Indigenous grievances long ignored. And this spirit of resistance was not limited to North America. In Australia, the Aboriginal land rights movement fought tirelessly for justice. For years, Aboriginal activists challenged the legal fictions that denied their existence. Their persistence led to the historic Mabwa decision in 1992, which finally recognized the traditional land rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, striking down the colonial myth of terra nullius, nobody's land. These stories remind us that resistance was not just about fighting back, it was about survival, unity, and reclaiming identity. Armed uprisings, peaceful advocacy, and international movements all wove together a rich tapestry of struggle. And even today, modern Indigenous movements draw strength from these legacies. They carry forward the same fire, the same determination, proving that while colonialism sought to silence them, their voices only grew louder with time. History is not only told through dates and documents, it is written in the pain of people. When we look at the case studies of Indigenous rights violations, we see not isolated incidents, but a pattern, a system designed to strip away land, culture, and identity. Take, for instance, the Trail of Tears. In the 1830s, the Cherokee Nation was forced from its ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States. Under the Indian Removal Act, thousands were made to walk hundreds of miles westward. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. Families were torn apart, traditions disrupted, and sovereignty crushed. The Trail of Tears was more than a journey, it was a march of suffering, a symbol of how colonial policies shattered Indigenous nations. Across the ocean in Australia, another tragedy unfolded. Known as the Stolen Generations, Aboriginal children were taken from their families, sometimes by force, sometimes by deception, under government policy. From the late 19th century until the 1970s, these children were placed in institutions or fostered into white families, cut off from their culture, their language, and their roots. The result was not just trauma for one generation, but a wound passed down through many, a legacy of separation and loss that Aboriginal communities still struggle to heal today. And in New Zealand, the Maori land wars of the 19th century tell yet another story of dispossession. British settlers, hungry for land, clashed with Maori tribes. Promises made in the Treaty of Waitangi, a treaty that was meant to safeguard Maori rights, were broken. The wars left behind bloodshed, lost lands, and a deep mistrust that continues to shape Maori struggles for recognition. Each of these case studies tells us the same truth: colonial governance was not neutral. It was a force that dismantled lives, identities, and nations. And the echoes of these injustices are still felt today, in land disputes, in cultural revival movements, in calls for justice and reparations. To understand the present, we must remember these stories not as distant history, but as living wounds that demand acknowledgement and healing. Imagine the sun rising over nations once bound in the chains of colonial rule. The empires have long withdrawn, but their shadows still stretch across the lands, etched into politics, culture, and identity. This is the post-colonial world, a world where the wounds of history are not easily forgotten. Former colonies continue to wrestle with the injustices of their past. And at the heart of this struggle lies a vital question: how can Indigenous rights, once stripped away, be restored and protected today? Across the globe, reconciliation efforts are unfolding. Some nations are seeking to heal through truth commissions, apologies, and reparations. Others witness the rise of powerful Indigenous rights movements, voices that refuse to be silenced, demanding dignity, land, and recognition. And then, there is the role of international law, treaties, human rights conventions, and global organizations working to safeguard what was once denied. Together, these threads form the ongoing story of post-colonial societies, a story not just of pain, but also of resilience, courage, and hope for justice. Picture a nation standing at a crossroads. Behind it lies a painful past of injustice, and ahead, the possibility of healing. This is the essence of reconciliation, a journey not just of governments and institutions, but of people, voices, and truths long silenced. In many post-colonial societies, truth commissions have become powerful tools to confront history. They open the doors to stories once buried, giving victims a platform to speak, to be heard, and to reclaim their dignity. Take South Africa, for example. After the fall of apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission became a beacon of hope. Though its focus was on apartheid, it also drew attention to the deeper scars left by colonialism. The message was clear: without acknowledging the past, there can be no real justice. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission examined the devastating legacy of the residential school system, where Indigenous children were torn from their families and culture. Its final report echoed with urgent calls to action: honor Indigenous land rights, protect their languages, and revive the traditions once silenced. And in Australia, in 2008, the national apology to the stolen generations marked a profound moment. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stood before the nation and admitted the wrongs done to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. That apology was not just words, it was a recognition of their right to dignity, self-determination, and cultural survival. But reconciliation is never easy. It requires more than apologies, it demands action, reforms, and above all, respect for the voices of Indigenous peoples. Only when their agency is at the center of the process can reconciliation transform from a political gesture into a living reality of healing and justice. Imagine voices that were once silenced now rising again, voices of resilience, of culture, of a people determined to reclaim what was taken from them. In recent years, we have witnessed a powerful resurgence of Indigenous rights movements across the world. These movements are not just political campaigns, they are cries for justice, for dignity, and for self-determination. At their heart lies a demand to reclaim land, to protect sacred traditions, and to secure the right to decide their own future. From remote villages to global stages, Indigenous communities are organizing, building coalitions, and using modern tools like social media to make sure their stories are heard. One striking example comes from the United States, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline. This wasn't just a protest, it was a stand for sacred land, for clean water, for the very right to exist in harmony with nature. The world watched as Indigenous voices, joined by environmental activists and allies, united in a struggle against corporate power that placed profit above human rights. In New Zealand, the Waitangi Tribunal has become a symbol of justice, addressing the grievances tied to the Treaty of Waitangi signed in 1840. Though progress has been made in acknowledging Maori rights, the journey remains long and filled with challenges. The tribunal's work reflects the ongoing struggle for equity, fairness, and respect. Globally, indigenous movements are reaching beyond borders. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007, has become a guiding light. It asserts the right to self-determination, cultural preservation, and participation in decision-making. While not legally binding, it serves as a rallying point for communities fighting to be recognized on the international stage. Yet, the road is far from easy. Governments resist, legal systems drag on, and the deep scars of colonization to poverty, discrimination, marginalization continue to weigh heavily on indigenous communities. Still, these movements remind us of one undeniable truth: the fight for indigenous rights is not over. It is alive, growing, and shaping a future where justice may finally prevail. When we think about the fight for indigenous rights, it's not just a local struggle, it is a global one. And at the heart of this global struggle lies international law, a powerful yet imperfect tool that has shaped the conversation on justice, dignity, and accountability for indigenous peoples. Through treaties, conventions, and declarations, the world has attempted to set standards, rules that say indigenous communities must be respected, their lands protected, and their voices heard. These legal instruments serve as a mirror, forcing states to face their responsibilities before the world stage. One of the greatest milestones came in 2007 with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. This historic document recognized, perhaps for the first time at a global level, the rights of indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources. It demanded that no decision affecting them should be made without their free, prior, and informed consent. Yet, even as many nations embraced it, the implementation has been patchy. For many communities, the promises of UNDRIP still remain words on paper rather than reality on the ground. Another key pillar is the International Labour Organization's Convention No. 169, dedicated to the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples. It emphasizes consultation, participation, and the right to shape policies that directly affect indigenous lives. Although not every country has ratified this convention, it continues to stand as a guiding light for advocacy across the globe. Regional mechanisms also play a vital role. Take the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, for example. In the Americas, this body has repeatedly held governments accountable, addressing cases of stolen lands, erased cultures, and projects imposed without indigenous consent. Its rulings remind us that indigenous rights are not optional, they are human rights. Yet, despite these achievements, challenges remain. Too often, economic interests outweigh justice. Too often, governments lack the political will to put international commitments into practice. And too often, indigenous voices are heard in conferences but silenced in real policies. Still, the framework is there: the declarations, the conventions, the rulings. And with persistent advocacy, growing solidarity, and unwavering resilience, international law remains one of the strongest tools to confront injustice and push the world closer to a future where indigenous rights are not just recognized, but fully respected.